The rise and fall of the Judean state. A political, social, and religious history of the Second Commonwealth. By Solomon Zeitlin. 1962. Picking up in Volume 1, Part 2, midway through. The title, Between Egypt and Syria. Picking up on subtitle, The High Priest Onias III and his cousin Simon. A sharp struggle arose between the high priest Onias III and his cousin Simon, captain of the temple, over the latter's effort to wrest control of the market of the city of Jerusalem from Onias III. A victory in this contest would involve the entire economic life of the Judeans. Simon, knowing that the people were opposed to him and favored Onias, turned to King Seleucus IV for support. He informed the king that Onias had allied himself with Hyrcanus, who favored the Ptolemies and was an enemy of the Seleucids. In proof of his charge, he stated that Onias had hidden funds in the temple which were not intended for sacrifices, and that some of these belonged to Hyrcanus. King Seleucus IV sent his prime minister, Heliodorus, to investigate the charges. When Heliodorus arrived in Jerusalem, he was received cordially by Onias, but when he expressed a desire to enter the temple in order to confiscate the money which was said to be hidden there, he was refused entrance. Onias told him that the money had been deposited there mostly by widows and orphans. He admitted that part of the money in the temple belonged to Hyrcanus, but he defended him against the accusation of his enemy, his half-brother Simon. Onias further told Heliodorus that it would be wrong and sacrilegious to enter the temple and confiscate the money of the people who had put trust in its holiness. Heliodorus, however, insisted on entering the temple and confiscating the money for Seleucus. He ignored the pleadings of Onias and of the entire community of Jerusalem and proceeded to carry out his plan. The epitomis of 2 Maccabees, in relating the story of the entrance of Heliodorus into the temple, embellished and adorned it with great rhetoric skill. He also presented a pathetic portrayal of the high priest and the inhabitants of Jerusalem as they witnessed the event. The author of 2 Maccabees gives this account of what transpired. Heliodorus entered, and a great apparition appeared, which struck him and his company with panic. It was said that they saw horses bearing riders who flogged him unceasingly. Heliodorus was rendered speechless and was carried out of the temple. Onias was asked to pray for him. Heliodorus also offered sacrifices to God for saving his life. He thanked Onias for the prayers offered to God in his behalf. He then returned home to the king. What really happened to Heliodorus in the temple is open to speculation. Was a hoax perpetuated upon him by Onias during the darkness, and was he flogged by some of the priests of the temple? This view seems credible because the epitomis of 2 Maccabees states that the high priest Onias offered prayers for Heliodorus so that the king should not think that Heliodorus had been overcome by a human agency. Herodotus gives a remarkably parallel account of the approach of the army of Xerxes to Delphi, to enter the temple of Athena Pronea, to confiscate the treasury. He says, and here's the quote, "When the barbarians were near in their coming to the temple of Athena Pronea, they were smitten by thunderbolts from heaven, and two peaks broke off from Parnassus, and came rushing among them with a mighty noise, and overwhelmed many of them. And from the temple of Athena there was heard a shout and a cry of triumph." Personal footnote, if you care to leave a comment, I find it interesting. I haven't covered Herodotus in great detail, haven't explored it, but I find it interesting that he used the word barbarians describing the Greeks that stormed the temple. Does anybody know why this is the case? Barbarians? Really? Why would Greeks call other Greeks barbarians? Was this a Macedonian thing? Derivative thing? What? Anyway, we'll leave it as is. But that's the end of the quote. He adds significantly, "Two men-at-arms of stature greater than human had followed hard after him, the barbarians slaying and pursuing." Did I misunderstand that? Anyway, it seems more likely, however, that Heliodorus entered into some arrangement with Onias that enabled them to settle the matter satisfactorily. Heliodorus already had formed plans to assassinate his king, Seleucus IV, and crown himself king of Syria. Perhaps he thought it advisable to have the high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem and the leader of the Judeans as his friend. Simon thus did not attain his ambitions, but, being a true son of his father Joseph, neither would he give it up. His next step against Onias was to accuse him of conspiring against the government. The enmity between the two factions now became so intense that they even resorted to assassination. Onias realized that there was a possibility of civil war in Jerusalem in which Simon and the sons of Joseph would have the protection of Apollonius. Onias realized that there was a possibility of civil war in Jerusalem in which Simon and the sons of Joseph would have the protection of Apollonius. Onias realized that was Onias realized that there was a possibility of civil war in Jerusalem in which Simon and the sons of Joseph would have the protection of Apollonius, the governor of Coel, Syria. He therefore set out for Antioch to seek King Seleucus in person. He hoped to explain to him that his action in preventing Heliodorus from entering the temple was in accord with the privilege given to the Judeans by his father, Antiochus III, that forbade foreigners to enter the temple. This would prove that his act was not due to disloyalty, and that he had no wish to join the Ptolemaic party, the epitomis of 2 Maccabees speaks of the journey in the following words. The quote, "He went over their heads to the king, not desirous of being an accuser of his fellow citizens, but merely with the idea of preserving the welfare, both public and private. He saw that without the king's intervention it would never be possible for the government to attain peace, and that Simon would not put an end to his folly." End of quote. The author, or rather the epitomist, of 2 Maccabees was a steadfast adherent of Onias and was prejudiced against his opponents. Nevertheless, it was clear from his chronicle that Onias's mission to the king of Antioch was to win him over to his side and thus have Simon removed from his post in the temple. The mission was not successful. Before he arrived, or soon after his arrival in Antioch, King Seleucus was assassinated by Heliodorus. Antiochus Epiphanes. When Seleucus was murdered, 3 pretenders claimed the royal crown. To clarify the situation, it will help to recapitulate somewhat. Antiochus III, after his defeat by the Romans, sent his younger son, Antiochus, the brother of Seleucus IV, as a hostage to Rome. When Seleucus ascended the throne after the death of Antiochus III, he gave his own son, Demetrius, as a hostage to the Romans in place of his brother Antiochus. King Seleucus had another son also named Antiochus, who was an infant when his father was assassinated. Was Heliodorus's plan to declare the baby Antiochus king, while he himself would rule as regent, or to declare himself king? The sources are silent. They do say that Antiochus, the brother of Seleucus IV, who had been released by the Romans, was in Athens when his brother was assassinated by Heliodorus. When the news reached Athens, Antiochus moved to seize the government, and Eumenes, king of Pergamum, came to his assistance with an army. Antiochus marched to Antioch, where the people received him and declared him king. The fate of Heliodorus is a matter of conjecture. Was he put to death by Antiochus, or did he flee the country? Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, succeeded to the Syrian kingdom at the end of 176 BCE. He was daring and energetic. When a hostage in Rome, he familiarized himself with the domestic and foreign policies of the Roman government. He was aware that Rome had designs on the eastern Mediterranean coast and believed she would eventually try to conquer all this territory. He was haunted by the defeat of his father, Antiochus III. He felt that one of the chief reasons for the Roman victory was that the eastern states were not united. He determined to prevent a repetition of this by uniting Syria and Egypt into a single strong state under Seleucid rule. Thus, his primary concern was to prevent Roman penetration into the Near East. In order to succeed with this policy, he sought to Hellenize his eastern lands so as to create a homogeneous state under one strong central government. More than any Syrian king before him, Antiochus IV insisted that he be recognized and worshipped as a god. He named himself Theos Epiphanes, God manifest, and declared that he was a god in the flesh. His religious policy had clear political overtones. since enforcing the worship of the king by all his subjects served him in his policy of unifying and Hellenizing his realm. Polybius says that Antiochus IV was regarded as a madman by some of his contemporaries and was called Epiphanes, mad instead of Epiphanes. That would be Epimanes, mad instead of Epiphanes, manifest. He was apparently quite eccentric. He participated in many theatrical performances. He would often, in the words of Polybius, doff his royal robe and pick up a toga and so make the circuit of the marketplace. He enjoyed playing practical jokes on his friends and on the dignitaries of the court. In part, this behavior may be traced to his years in Rome. While a hostage there, he had come to approve the Roman manner of life and was much attracted by democratic government. His personality, thus, was a combination of the despotism of the East and the democracy of Rome, conflicting ways of life. Though a small country, Judea now became very important for Antiochus because she could serve as a base for his proposed attack on Egypt. She would also provide an outlet to the sea. To secure the complete loyalty of Judea, he had to rely upon the sons of Joseph, who were pro-Seleucid and favored the Hellenization of Judea. This was the fundamental conflict between the high priest Onias and the sons of Joseph. It did not revolve merely about the question of who should be the high priest and who should control the city market. The conflict had far wider implications. It had its roots in the perilous choice of policy that the Judeans had to make. Onias and his associates sought to perpetuate Judean life in accordance with the laws of the Pentateuch and the ideals of the prophets. This faction wanted their life to be centered around the temple and was opposed to foreign cultural influences. The sons of Joseph, Simon, and his brothers, although they were priests and descendants of the high priest Simon I, lost interest in Judaism. As tax collectors, they were subject to the foreign influences of the Ptolemean and the Seleucidan courts. Hellenism exerted a strong influence upon them. They probably spoke Greek most of the time. They bore Greek names. They followed Greek customs. They mingled in Greek society at home and abroad. They witnessed athletic games in which prominent Greeks took part and which were a source of national pride to the Hellenes. They were most anxious to introduce these games into their own country, a measure of their assimilation. There was good reason for this. The sons of Joseph, the Tobias family, were the leaders of the new aristocracy of wealth. They were responsible for converting Jerusalem from an obscure, insignificant town into a prominent city. But their economic gains could only be fulfilled if Jerusalem could have the privileges of a Hellenistic city. They were handicapped in their commercial enterprises because Jerusalem did not have the privilege of coinage, whereas other cities like Tyre did. To Hellenize Jerusalem, they desired to establish a gymnasium in Jerusalem and form bodies of ephoboi, the corps of young men associated with it. This being the central institution of the Hellenistic city. For the economic advancement of their circle, the Tobiads were even ready to relinquish their Judaism. They knew they could not achieve their goal as long as Onias III was the high priest. As a result, they conspired to remove him from his office and to give the high priesthood to his brother Joshua, who bore the Greek name Jason and was more sympathetic to their Hellenizing policy. Onias, who had gone to Antioch to plead his case before King Seleucus, remained there for some time after Antiochus IV ascended the throne. Finally, realizing that the new king was unfavorably disposed to him, Onias fled to Egypt. The author of 2 Maccabees says that when Onias suspected that there was a plot against his life, he sought asylum in the temple at Daphne, near Antioch. He left the sanctuary through a ruse devised by a courtier named Andronicus, and thereupon immediately met his death. According to 2 Maccabees, his death had been instigated by Onias Menelaus. It aroused not only the indignation of the Judeans, but that of the king himself. He ordered Andronicus put to death. But the sources are in conflict. According to Diodorus, Antiochus Epiphanes put Andronicus to death for another reason, namely, that he had murdered his nephew, the boy Antiochus, the son of King Seleucus IV. As a matter of fact, Antiochus IV had his nephew put to death to relieve himself of a future pretender to his throne. This crime aroused great indignation in Antioch. When Antiochus IV learned of the resentment of the people, he put Andronicus to death to show that he himself had taken no part in the murder of his nephew. It seems likely that the story of the murder of Onias III was invented by the author of 2 Maccabees. It is unlikely that Onias, a genuine adherent of Judaism, would have taken refuge in a heathen temple. This would have been tantamount to recognition of its deity. The purpose of inventing the assassination of the high priest Onias was to make him a martyr. In any event, Onias was no longer in Syria when Onias Menelaus became the high priest, but in Egypt, where he received permission from Ptolemy V and Cleopatra to build a temple. He built it in Heliopolis, and it became known as the Temple of Onias. He chose Heliopolis rather than Alexandria, which had the largest Jewish settlement in Egypt, because Jewish tradition associated Heliopolis with the abode of Jacob and his sons upon their arrival in Egypt. It was also traditionally connected with Moses. Sentiment was decisive, and Onias, therefore, picked Heliopolis as the most appropriate place for his temple. Antiochus IV and Joshua Jason. After Onias had fled to Egypt, the office of the high priest became vacant. His brother, Joshua Jason, maneuvered to obtain it for himself. Although a son of Onias III, who also bore the name of Onias, was living in Jerusalem, Joshua Jason's cousins, the sons of Joseph, who were priests but not in the dynastic succession, were apparently not yet ready to violate Jewish tradition by seizing the high priesthood. For the time being, they favored Joshua Jason as the high priest because he was amenable to their plans. They thought his accession might also be a stepping stone to their ambition, that one of them would eventually assume the high priesthood. Joshua Jason's becoming high priest was in itself a violent departure from Jewish tradition, since only the eldest son, not a brother, could succeed his father in that office while a son was still living. The sons of Joseph hoped, therefore, that tradition having been broken, they themselves would in time be able to depose Joshua Jason and usurp the high priesthood. Joshua Jason, following the precedent set by the Persian kings and later by the Ptolemies, sought confirmation in his office by King Antiochus. He secured an audience with the king and promised to give him 360 talents of silver and an additional 80 talents from another fund of an enormous sum. He also promised the king 150 talents more if he were given permission to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem and to register the Jerusalemites as Antiochians. That is, to incorporate a Hellenistic city in Jerusalem. No doubt these manifestations of Hellenistic interest by Joshua Jason, and of course the large sum of money preferred, appealed to Antiochus. He was not only zealously Philhellenic, but he was particularly eager to fulfill his political ambition of Hellenizing Judea and making Syria a homogeneous state. Thus, when Jason became high priest in 175 to 174, a gymnasium was built in Jerusalem. Sorry, we're just going to read that back again concerning the name of Joshua Jason. Where are we here? We just pick up again. No doubt these manifestations of Hellenistic interest by Joshua Jason, and of course the large sum of money preferred, appealed to Antiochus. He was not only zealously Philhellenic, but he was particularly eager to fulfill his political ambition of Hellenizing Judea and making Syria a homogeneous state. One more time. He was not only zealously Philhellenic, but he was particularly eager to fulfill his political ambition of Hellenizing Judea and making Syria a homogeneous state. Thus, when Jason became high priest in 175 to 174, a gymnasium was built in Jerusalem. Judean youths, including priests, exposed their nude bodies during the athletic games. Indeed, some of the priests who participated in athletics in the outside of Judea had surgeons draw forward their prepuces so that their circumcisions would not be noticeable, thus disguising their Judean origins. The Greek hat, petasis, was seen in Jerusalem on the heads of Judean youths. The aristocrats of the Hellenizing group called themselves Antiochians of Jerusalem rather than Judeans. There can be no doubt that the rank and file of the Judeans regarded these activities of the high priest with disgust and contempt. They saw this office, regarded as sacred for centuries, now turned into a degraded political position. They saw the high moral and spiritual ideas of monotheism, the worship of one God, the God of Israel, who was the God of the universe, largely abandoned in favor of pagan Hellenism. Cleopatra, who became queen regent after the death of her husband, Ptolemy V Epiphanes, in the year 181, apparently died suddenly in the year 173 to 172. She had maintained peace with Syria and had not given Rome any cause for complaint. After her death, royal power was seized by two men of the court. Eulaeus, the chief eunuch of the court, and Linnaeus, a native of Coele, Syria. The new rulers were anti-Seleucid, and were ready to launch a war against Antiochus to recover Coel, Syria. In order not to provide Rome with an excuse to interfere, they hastened the Anacleteria, the inauguration of the boy king as coming of age. Apollonius, who represented Antiochus IV Epiphanes at the enthronement of Ptolemy VI, reported to his king that the policy of the Ptolemaic court endangered the peace, and that the new rulers in Alexandria were planning to re-annex Coel, Syria. Antiochus to forestall the threatened invasion by Ptolemy, moved south with a military force and proceeded as far as Jaffa. He was by then convinced that the entire country was tranquil and that there was no menace to his realm. From Jaffa, he proceeded to Jerusalem and was received by the high priest, Jason, and his followers with great acclamation. The Judeans of the city marched through the streets carrying blazing torches in honor of the king. Thus Jason became entrenched as high priest and a favorite of King Antiochus Epiphanes. To flatter the king, Jason later sent Aetheros, a sacred embassy, to the athletic games which were held in Tyre, in the presence of Antiochus. The ambassadors were chosen from the Judeans of the Antiochian corporation of Jerusalem and were given money to provide for a sacrifice to Hercules at the games. Considering a sacrifice to Hercules sacrilegious, they used the money for other purposes. Onias Menelaus. The sons of Joseph, who had maneuvered the appointment of Joshua Jason, the brother of Onias, as high priest, now determined to secure the high priesthood for one of themselves. The first deviation from the ancient tradition of dynastic succession, the transference of the office of high priest by appointment instead of through inheritance, had been effected by the selection of Jason. Now it was easier to work for a further deviation. By having a high priest appointed who was not of the immediate high priestly family, an opportunity soon presented itself. The high priest Jason sent his cousin, Onias Menelaus, the son of Joseph, to Antiochus with money which presumably was to pay the purchase price of the high priesthood. Onias Menelaus shrewdly thought this was an opportune time for him to secure the high priesthood for himself. On being received by the king, he flattered him and assured him that he would be more zealous than ever in following the king's policy in the Hellenization of Judea. To make good his words, he offered 300 silver talents above the amount that Jason had paid. The sum thus involved was extremely large. Antiochus Epiphanes was moved by Onias Menelaus' promise of extra zeal in Hellenization. The king, who regarded the temple as part of his realm, accepted the offer of Joseph's son. He dismissed Jason and appointed Onias Menelaus as the high priest. Jason, however, did not yield, and an acrimonious fight broke out between their respective followers. Most of the Judeans were on the side of Joshua Jason, while the sons of Joseph, the Tobias family, and their adherents were on the side of their kinsman Onias Menelaus. Onias Menelaus was compelled to flee from Jerusalem. He went to Antioch to complain to the king that Joshua Jason and his followers refused to recognize him as the high priest, and thereby flouted the king's authority. Antiochus sent a military command to compel the Judeans to accept Onias Menelaus as the high priest. Joshua Jason fled the country to Jordan, where previously his cousin Hyrcanus had found refuge. Onias Menelaus thus obtained the office of the high priesthood through the military power given him by King Antiochus. Trouble loomed, however, for Onias Menelaus, not only because of popular opposition to his appointment, but also because he was not able to raise the money he had promised the king. Antiochus summoned him, and Sostratus, the governor of Jerusalem, before leaving Jerusalem for Antioch. Onias Menelaus appointed his brother, Lysimachus, to act as high priest in his absence and to go about raising the necessary funds. Lysimachus proceeded to rob the temple of many golden vessels, a sacrilegious act which aroused great indignation among the people. Crowds rioted in Jerusalem, pitched battles were fought in the streets, and many Judeans were killed. Charges were brought to the king against Onias Menelaus for stealing the golden vessels. 3 men, representatives of the Gerousia, the temple senate, were deputized to bring these charges. Onias Menelaus not only managed to clear himself of the charges, but succeeded in gaining further favor with Antiochus. He accomplished this by bribing Ptolemy, the son of Dorymenes, a friend of the king. The 3 deputies of the Gerousia were put to death, and Onias Menelaus received even greater authority from the king. On his return to Jerusalem, he intensified his policy of Hellenization. Antiochus IV and Egypt. The suzerainty of Coel Syria was still under contest by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The war partly in Alexandria, represented by the eunuch Eulaeus, and by Linnaeus, maintained that this country was a part of Egypt by virtue of the fact that Ptolemy I took possession of it after the death of Alexander the Great. Furthermore, they asserted that when Antiochus III gave his daughter Cleopatra in marriage to Ptolemy V, he assigned Coel Syria to her as a dowry. Antiochus, on the other hand, held that the country was a part of the Seleucid Empire, according to the Treaty of 301 after the victory at Ipsus. He denied that the country had been given as a dowry, insisting that only the taxes were so given. Both parties had sent embassies to Rome to present their cases before the Senate. Eulaeus and Linnaeus, who directed the policy of the child king Ptolemy VI, Philometor, thought it was an auspicious time to make war on Antiochus. With Rome engaged in a struggle with King Perseus of Macedonia, she would be unable to forestall their ambition to recover Coel Syria. So in the year 171 to 170, the Egyptian army marched across the border. The regents, Eulaeus and Linnaeus, before leaving Alexandria, boastfully assured the populace that they would not only recover Coel Syria, but would destroy the whole Seleucid dynasty. Antiochus Epiphanes met the enemy with his army before they crossed the desert, defeating them and marched through Pelusium into the land of the pyramids. He then moved up the river to Memphis, and according to Jerome was formally crowned by the Egyptians' priests as king of Egypt. Jerome is confirmed by 1 Maccabees, where it is said that Antiochus seized upon the idea of becoming king of the land of Egypt. It was indeed a great success for Antiochus Epiphanes. It was the first time since Alexander the Great that Egypt was successfully invaded from Coel, Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes had succeeded where Perdiccas Antigonus and his father Antiochus the Great had failed. The child king Ptolemy VI may have been badly advised by his regents, or perhaps it was an act of treachery on their part to have him flee Alexandria by sea to the sacred land of Samothrace, for he was intercepted there by Antiochus. Ptolemy was ready to accept the protectorate which would unite the two royal lines and create a unified Hellenistic state in the east. But the people of Alexandria revolted against such a union and determined to resist Antiochus. They called the younger son of Ptolemy V to the throne and gave him the surname of Euergetes II. Egypt thus became divided into two rival kingdoms, one in Alexandria under Ptolemy Euergetes, who was nicknamed Ptolemy Physcon, Fat Paunch, and the other in Memphis under Ptolemy Philometor. When the Achaean League and other Greek cities urged Antiochus to make peace with Egypt, he replied that he was not at war with the legitimate Egyptian king Ptolemy VI. He said that the only condition he wished to impose upon Alexandria was that it recall the rightful king. Antiochus returned in triumph from Egypt. Egypt, being divided between two rival kings, was at his mercy. In the summer of 170, he invaded Jerusalem, entered the temple, confiscated much of the gold there, and put many Judeans to death. The massacres which he ordered were his reply to the protest against his entering the temple and confiscating its treasury. Antiochus Epiphanes' policy in regard to Egypt soon met with reverses. The two brothers were reconciled, and it was agreed that they should be joint kings, reigning together in Alexandria. When the schism in Egypt came to an end, Antiochus was left in an embarrassing position. He had insisted that his interference in Egypt was to support the legitimate king, but the peace established between the two brothers prevented him from exercising the power he truly desired. Antiochus Epiphanes sought to prevent another Ptolemaic invasion of Coel, Syria, by launching a war against Egypt. The war between Rome and Macedonia was now favoring Rome. Antiochus, who was well acquainted with the foreign policy of Rome since her victory over Carthage, saw in Rome's Macedonian victory a further step towards the domination of the entire Mediterranean coast. To forestall this, Antiochus decided to annex Egypt and thus have one strong united Hellenistic kingdom serve as a bastion against Rome's spreading power. In the year 169 to 168, Antiochus marched with a large army against Egypt. Again he was victorious. He almost achieved his ambition of annexing Egypt to Syria and becoming the ruler of a single mighty state. A dream of his forebears could never even have entertained. But as his plans came near to realization, they were upset by Rome. In the battle at Pydna, in the summer of 168, the Romans won a great victory over the army of King Perseus and Macedonia, as a kingdom came to an end. After Rome had won its victory, she focused her foreign policy on subjugating the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Roman Senate now viewed the proposed annexation of Egypt by Antiochus Epiphanes as a menace to their country. An embassy was sent to Antiochus under the leadership of the consul Popilius Laenus, demanding that he retire from Egypt. When Antiochus asked for time to take counsel, Popilius Laenus delivered a characteristic ultimatum. He drew a circle around Antiochus and bade him decide on the spot and not go out of that ring until he had given an answer to the Senate, whether he would have peace or war with Rome. Antiochus replied that he would obey the Senate. Antiochus retreated along the coast of Judea, having lost Egypt. He more than ever wanted Judea to be solidly united with the Seleucid kingdom. Judea was a buffer country which would protect him in the event of an Egyptian attack. His discomfiture in connection with the ultimatum of Popilius started a rumor that he had died. Repercussions were felt in Judea. Joshua Jason, the former high priest, accepted the rumor as fact and marched with an army of about 1,000 men upon Jerusalem and stormed it. Onias Menelaus fled and took refuge in the citadel, where he fortified himself against Jason. Civil war broke out in Jerusalem between their followers. Joshua Jason apparently was not very successful, since he had to fight the followers of Onias Menelaus, as well as those of his own brother Onias. He also did not receive substantial enough support from the people to enable him to gain control of the city. When the news reached King Antiochus, who was retreating with his army from Egypt, that a revolt had broken out against him in Jerusalem, he marched against the city, for he saw in the strife there not merely a fratricidal war, but an uprising against himself. He regarded Jason as pro-Ptolemaic, and could not now afford to see Judea become a part of the Ptolemaic Empire. He therefore launched a powerful attack against Jerusalem. Jason again had to flee the country. First, he found refuge in Transjordan, but, feeling insecure, there he sought asylum in Egypt. He thought he would be welcome there, since he was fighting Antiochus, the arch-enemy of the Ptolemies. However, the Egyptian government debarred him from entering the country, where his brother Onias dwelt. The Ptolemaic government knew that Jason had previously been pro-Seleucid. He finally found refuge among the Lacedaemonians. Antiochus IV and the Judeans. Antiochus entered Jerusalem and had thousands of Judeans slaughtered. He took many more thousands captive and sold them into slavery. He entered the temple accompanied by Onias Menelaus. The wars with Egypt had depleted his treasury, and his need for money was heightened, since he had to pay annual indemnities to Rome under the peace treaty of Apamea. He therefore stripped the temple of its gold and silver vessels and golden altar, the golden menorah, the display table, and sacred curtains. Before leaving the country, he authorized Apollonius, an officer of the Mysians, to enforce the Hellenization of Judea. Apollonius built the citadel, Acra, fortified it with high walls and towers, and stationed there a Macedonian garrison together with those Judeans who were loyal to Antiochus's policy. This citadel was situated on the southern spur of the eastern hill, south of the temple. It was of great strategical importance, since Jerusalem could be controlled from it. In the name of Antiochus, a decree was issued prohibiting the Judeans from following their own religion. Anyone found observing the Sabbath was considered a traitor and subject to capital punishment. Circumcision was banned, and those who practiced it were put to death. Daily sacrifice in the temple was abolished, most likely in the middle of the summer of 168. About 5 months later, on the 25th of Kislev, a heathen altar, the abomination of desolation, was erected on the site of the old altar, and a swine was sacrificed on it. The temple itself was consecrated to Zeus Olympus. Onias Menelaus was no longer the high priest of the temple of the God of Israel, but a priest subordinate to Antiochus Epiphanes. The Hasidim Essenes. Antiochus looked upon those Judeans who did not submit to Hellenization as traitors. He suspected them of being pro-Ptolemean, hence he decided to get rid of them and make Jerusalem safe for the Seleucid dynasty. Since he was a convinced Philhellene, he could not understand why the Judeans refused to accept the gods of the Hellenes, while the other peoples of Syria welcomed them. He considered the Jewish religion superstitious in comparison with Hellenism. All the peoples of the Hellenistic world consecrated their deities by the statues and images which they erected in the temples and streets of the cities. Judaism had no statues nor images, and it was difficult for him to comprehend how a people could worship a god and have no idols of him. While we do not know whether all the people of Syria willingly accepted Hellenistic culture, it is clear that they offered no serious resistance. The only one who opposed Antiochus's attempt to Hellenize them were the Judeans. He not only suspected them of siding with the Ptolemies, but saw them wrecking his plan of Hellenizing the East. Hence, he decided that if he could not Hellenize them peaceably, he would do so by force or exterminate them. Thus, he sought to Hellenize all those who worshipped the God of Israel regardless of where they lived. The epitomist of 2 Maccabees portrays the gruesome martyrdom in Antioch of Eleazar and the 7 brothers. Although the story of the martyrdom is legend, it is, like all legends, based on historical facts, namely that Antiochus Epiphanes persecuted the Judeans who lived in Antioch. There can be no doubt that the Hellenistic party in Jerusalem, led by the high priest Onias Menelaus, deplored the policy of Antiochus. They had thought that they would be able to Hellenize the Judeans, make Jerusalem a Greek city, and thus themselves become citizens of the great Seleucid Empire. Antiochians of the city of Jerusalem. Now their plans were frustrated. Jerusalem and Judea became an integral part of Syria, and Onias Menelaus was now but an instrument of Antiochus in his plan to destroy the city and exterminate the Judeans. Many willingly submitted to Antiochus's decrees and even helped prosecute their fellow Judeans for not obeying the king's orders. Eventually, they abandoned Judaism and became renegades to the Judean people. Some obeyed the king's orders through fear of the severe punishments which would be inflicted upon them by Antiochus's officers. The rank and file of Judeans, however, remained loyal to Judaism. They met the edicts of Antiochus with silent scorn. They kept the Sabbath and circumcised their children. They refrained from eating swine or sacrificing the swine on the altars which were erected in every town and village. Those who were caught observing the Judean laws were tortured and slain, and those who were found to have circumcised their children were crucified together with their infants. Burial of those slain for having observed the Judean law was not permitted, and their bodies were left in the street. The psalmist referred to this in the following words: "The bodies of thy servant have been given to be meat unto the fowls of heaven, the flesh of thy Hasidim unto the beasts of the earth. They have shed their blood like water around Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them." A new Judean group called the Hasidim came onto being in the year 168 to 167. Josephus later designated them Essenes. In the face of great danger, they observed the Judean laws meticulously. The Hasidim were ready to face torture and death and would not even resist their enemies if they involved any violation of the law. The author of 1 Maccabees gives an account of what happened when 1,000 people hid in a cave in order to observe the Sabbath. When the agents of Antiochus discovered their whereabouts, they threatened to burn them alive in the cave unless they would come out and profane the Sabbath. The Judeans refused, but they offered no resistance, refusing to fight on the Sabbath day. As a result, they were burned alive. They were extremists, and they arose as a reaction to the other extremists who were willing to give up Judaism for Hellenism, and proudly marched in the processions for Dionysus, garlanded with ivy wreaths. As extremists, the Hasidim sought only to save their own souls, and were not interested in saving the law for the Judeans as a people. These Judeans who willingly faced torture and death for their belief in God were the first martyrs in history. The example of the Hasidim was later followed by the early Christians, who also faced death rather than forsake their religion. Religious persecution was previously unknown in the history of civilization. Polytheism encouraged tolerance. A vanquished people was required to accept the god of the conqueror, and if it had two gods, there was nothing to prohibit the addition of a third. Many cities changed the names of their deities to harmonize with the names of the deities of their conquerors. Thus Melkart, the deity of Tyre, had his name changed to Hercules. Only monotheists and universalists, who affirm one God, who is the exclusive God of the entire universe, cannot tolerate any other God. When Antiochus Epiphanes introduced Zeus into the temple, he abrogated Judaism. Even if he had allowed the God of Israel to share the temple with Zeus, the Judeans could not recognize such a partnership and retain their monotheistic faith. Antiochus IV and the Samaritans. The Samaritans in the north of Judea had their own temple on Mount Gerizim. During the time of intense persecution by Antiochus, the Samaritans wrote to the king commanding him for his acts against the Judeans. During the time of intense persecution by Antiochus, the Samaritans wrote to the king commending him for his acts against the Judeans. In a letter to him, they denied their kinship with the Judeans. They wrote, "Now you have dealt with the Judeans as their wickedness deserves, but the king's officers, in their belief that we follow the same practices as they, through kinship with them, are involving us in similar charges, whereas we are Sidonians by origin, as is evident from our state documents. We therefore petition you as our benefactor and savior to command Apollonius, the governor of the district, and Nicanor, the royal agent, not to molest us in any way by attaching to us the charges of which the Judeans are guilty, since we are distinct from them both in race and in customs. And we ask that the temple, without a name, on Mount Gerizim, be known as that of Zeus Hellenios. According to 2 Maccabees, the temple was dedicated to Zeus Zenios, the god of hospitality. It is being assumed that this letter, as given by Josephus, was forged by the Judeans to discredit the Samaritans. It has been held that they did not accept Hellenization so readily. If Judea had two groups that differed on the issue of Hellenization, a similar division undoubtedly existed among the Samaritans. The letter to Antiochus Epiphanes may well have been written by the Samaritan group devoted to Hellenization. The sentiment of this group was taken by the Judeans to represent that of the entire Samaritan people. And thus would plant the seeds of a bitter division and create the concept of enemy between the two. We'll pick up part 3, Judah Maccabee, in the next segment.